The pristine white BMW X7 hung precariously over the ravine, its front wheels spinning uselessly in the air as Karen's perfectly manicured nails clawed at her phone screen. 20 minutes earlier, she'd been laughing at Marcus's rust-eaten pickup truck in the grocery store parking lot, calling it an eyesore, loud enough for everyone to hear. Now, as storm clouds gathered overhead and her luxury SUV teetered on the edge of disaster, the same truck she'd mocked was the only thing between her and a 60-foot drop into the canyon below. But Marcus wasn't just any good Samaritan, he was the man whose construction company she'd systematically destroyed with lies, lawsuits, and stolen contracts. The very man whose life she'd nearly ruined was now the only person who the morning sun cast long shadows across the Millbrook shopping center parking lot as Marcus Rodriguez guided his 1998 Ford F-150 into a space near the grocery store entrance. The truck's faded blue paint was more primer than pigment now, and the passenger door bore a constellation of rust spots that bloomed like autumn leaves across the metal. But beneath the weathered exterior, the engine hummed with the steady reliability of a machine that had been loved and maintained by calloused hands. Marcus killed the engine and sat for a moment, checking his phone for the third time in 10 minutes. Still no callbacks from the 3 construction jobs he'd bid on last week. The rejection emails had become a familiar sting, always the same. Corporate language about going with another contractor or budget constraints, but Marcus knew the real reason. Karen Blackwood's poison had spread through the local business community like wildfire, and her lies had branded him as unreliable, expensive, and worse. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was shopping for groceries at the same upscale market where Karen held court with the other wives of Millbrook's elite. But Marcus had been coming to Greenfield Market for 15 years, long before Karen had moved to town with her investment banker husband, and he wasn't about to let her intimidate him into changing his routine. As he climbed out of the truck, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the driver's side window. At 38, he still maintained the lean, muscular build of a man who worked with his hands, but the stress of the past 6 months had etched new lines around his dark eyes. His black hair was shorter now, a concession to the job interviews that never seemed to go anywhere, and his usually confident posture had developed a subtle defensive hunch. The automatic doors of Greenfield Market whooshed open, releasing a burst of air-conditioned air that carried the mingled scents of fresh flowers and artisanal bread. Marcus grabbed a shopping cart and began making his way through the produce section, his mind already calculating the tight budget that would guide his purchases. Ground beef instead of steaks. Generic cereal instead of name brand. The mathematics of a man whose thriving construction business had been reduced to part-time handyman jobs and the occasional small repair. Well, look what the cat dragged in. The voice cut through the ambient noise of the market like a blade through silk. Marcus didn't need to turn around to know who had spoken. Karen Blackwood's voice had the particular pitch of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed, a frequency that seemed to resonate with entitlement and barely concealed disdain. Marcus kept his eyes on the tomatoes he was examining, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Maybe if he ignored her, she'd move on to torment someone else. But Karen Blackwood wasn't the type to be ignored. "I'm talking to you, Marcus." This time, several other shoppers turned to look. Marcus set down the tomato he'd been holding and slowly turned to face his tormentor. Karen stood near the organic lettuce display, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the fluorescent lights like spun gold. She wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, and her makeup was flawless. Despite the early hour. At 42, she maintained the kind of polished beauty that money could buy and maintain, but her green eyes held a coldness that no amount of expensive cosmetics could warm. "Karen." Marcus's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of a man who'd learned to control his reactions through painful experience. "I was just telling Janet here about that eyesore you call a truck." Karen gestured toward an older woman with silver hair who stood nearby, looking uncomfortable at being drawn into the conversation. "It's really bringing down the property values in this neighborhood, don't you think?" The woman, Janet, shifted awkwardly and mumbled something about needing to find her husband before hurrying away. But Karen's voice had carried, and Marcus could see other shoppers slowing their pace, drawn by the promise of drama like moths to a flame. "My truck is legally parked in a public parking space," Marcus said evenly. "I'm not aware of any ordinance." That regulates the age or appearance of vehicles in shopping centers. Karen's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, Marcus. Always hiding behind technicalities. Just like when you tried to wiggle out of those contract violations last year. The reference to his legal troubles hit Marcus like a physical blow. The contract violations Karen referenced were fabricated complaints she'd filed against Rodriguez Construction, claiming shoddy workmanship and missed deadlines on a bathroom renovation she'd never actually hired him to complete. The lies had been transparent to anyone who looked closely, but Karen had connections throughout the city's building department and enough money to keep lawyers busy for months. Those charges were dropped, Marcus said, his voice gaining a slight edge. As you well know. Were they? Karen's smile widened. I seem to remember there being quite a bit of smoke. And where there's smoke, the unfinished threat hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Marcus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had cost him 2 jobs and nearly gotten him arrested when he'd confronted Karen at the city council meeting where she'd spoken against his business license renewal. But this time, Marcus forced himself to breathe deeply. He thought of his daughter Sophia, who was counting on him to pay for her college textbooks next semester. He thought of his ex-wife Maria, who'd stood by him through the worst of Karen's assault on his reputation until the stress had finally torn their marriage apart. He thought of the 3 men who'd worked for him for years and were now scrambling to find employment because Rodriguez Construction had become radioactive in the local market. I'm just here to buy groceries, Karen, Marcus said quietly. Same as everyone else. Oh, but you're not the same as everyone else, are you? Karen's voice rose just enough to ensure that everyone within 30 feet could hear her clearly. You're the contractor who abandons jobs. The one who takes deposits and disappears. The one who, that's enough. The voice came from behind Marcus, and he turned to see David Chen, the owner of Chen's Hardware, approaching with his shopping cart. David was a small man in his 60s, but his presence seemed to fill the space around him. He'd been in Millbrook for 30 years, and his opinion carried weight in the community. Marcus has been a customer of mine for 15 years, David said, his voice calm but firm. He's honest, reliable, and does excellent work. I've seen his jobs, and I've never had a single complaint about any work he's done. Karen's perfect composure flickered for just a moment. I'm sure you mean well, David, but I mean what I say, David interrupted. And what I'm saying is that good men don't deserve to be harassed while they are trying to shop for groceries. The standoff stretched for several long seconds. Marcus could see the calculation in Karen's eyes as she weighed her options. She was outnumbered now, and David's reputation in the community was unassailable. But Karen Blackwood didn't retreat easily. Of course, she said finally, her voice returning to its practiced sweetness. I was just making conversation. No harm intended. She turned her attention back to the lettuce display, dismissing both men with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never learned to see other people as fully human. But Marcus caught the look she shot him over her shoulder, a promise that this encounter was far from over. David squeezed Marcus's shoulder briefly. Don't let her get to you, son. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Marcus nodded his thanks and watched David disappear around the corner toward the cereal aisle. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had left him feeling drained and exposed. He could see the other shoppers stealing glances at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy to barely concealed judgment. He finished his shopping quickly, avoiding the aisles where he could see Karen's distinctive blonde hair. At the checkout line, he found himself behind an elderly man who was counting out exact change for his purchases with the meticulous care of someone living on a fixed income. Marcus waited patiently, remembering his own grandmother's similar ritual during his childhood. Take your time, Mr. Peterson, the young cashier said kindly. No rush. The simple kindness of the interaction was a balm to Marcus's frayed nerves. Not everyone in Millbrook had bought into Karen's campaign of character assassination. There were still good people in the world, people who judged others by their actions rather than their gossip. As Marcus loaded his groceries into the truck bed, he noticed Karen emerging from the store with a shopping cart full of auger The call came at 2:47 p.m. while Marcus was replacing the rotted deck boards on Mrs. Henderson's back porch. His phone buzzed against his leg, displaying a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, unknown numbers rarely brought. Good news these days, but something made him wipe the sawdust from his hands and answer. Rodriguez Construction. Is this Marcus Rodriguez? The voice was crisp, professional, with the kind of authority that made people sit up straighter. Speaking. This is Detective Sarah Walsh with the Millbrook Police Department. I need to speak with you about some complaints that have been filed against your business. Can you come down to the station this afternoon? Marcus's grip tightened. On the phone. What kind of complaints? I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Are you available at 4 o'clock? The polite tone didn't fool Marcus. He'd been through this dance before. Am I being charged with something? No charges at this time. This is just a preliminary investigation. But I do need to speak with you today. Marcus glanced at his watch. It was already pushing 3 o'clock, and he'd promised Mrs. Henderson. He'd finish the deck before the weather turned. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind carried the electric smell of approaching rain. I'll be there, he said. The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone for a long moment, then looked up to find Mrs. Henderson watching him through her kitchen window. She was 83 years old and had hired him to replace her deck after her grandson had recommended Rodriguez Construction. The job paid exactly enough to cover his truck payment and part of his rent, but it was honest work, and Mrs. Henderson treated him with the kind of respect he'd almost forgotten existed. He knocked on her back door. Mrs. Henderson, I'm sorry, but I have to step out for a couple hours. I'll be back to finish this up before the rain hits. Her weathered face creased with concern. Is everything all right, dear? Police want to talk to me about some complaints. Probably nothing serious. But Mrs. Henderson had lived long enough to recognize the weight of unspoken worry. You be careful, Marcus. And if you need anything at all, you call me. The kindness in her voice nearly broke him. It was a reminder that not everyone in Millbrook had turned against him, that there were still people who judged him by his work rather than Karen's lies. 30 minutes later, Marcus sat in the sterile waiting area of the Millbrook police station, his work boots leaving small piles of sawdust on the polished floor. The building was modern and efficient, all glass and steel that reflected the town's recent prosperity. Through the windows, he could see the first fat raindrops beginning to spatter against the glass. Mr. Rodriguez. Detective Walsh was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 30s, with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of dealing with people's worst moments. She led him to a small interview room that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. I appreciate you coming in, she said, settling into the chair across from him. A manila folder lay on the table between them, thick with papers that made Marcus's stomach clench. I've been investigating some complaints against your construction company. What kind of complaints? Walsh opened the folder and pulled out a stack of official-looking documents. We've received reports of contract violations, substandard workmanship, and abandonment of job sites. The complaints span several months and involve multiple alleged victims. Marcus leaned forward, his carpenter's hands flat on the table. Detective, I can account for every job I've done in the past 2 years. I keep detailed records, photographs, receipts, I'm sure you do. Walsh's tone was neutral, professional. But these complaints are quite specific. They include dates, locations, and substantial financial damages. She slid a paper across the table. Marcus recognized the letterhead immediately. It was from the law firm that handled Karen's legal affairs. The complaint was signed by someone named Patricia Vance, claiming that Rodriguez Construction had abandoned a kitchen renovation job after taking a $5,000 deposit. I've never heard of Patricia Vance, Marcus said. And I haven't done any kitchen renovations in the past 6 months. What about this one? Walsh produced another document. This one was signed by a Robert Chen, claiming Marcus had installed a defective fence that had collapsed and injured his dog. Marcus stared at the signature, his mind racing. Robert Chen. David Chen owns the hardware store. This might be his brother, but I've never worked for him. And David would have mentioned if his brother had any problems with my work. And this one. A third document, this one claiming unpaid subcontractors and liens against property. With each paper, Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. The complaints were detailed, professional, and completely fabricated. But they painted a picture of a contractor who was irresponsible, dishonest, and potentially dangerous. "Detective, someone is setting me up," Marcus said. "These complaints are lies. Every single one of them." Walsh leaned back in her chair, studying him with those intelligent eyes. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Rodriguez. Are you suggesting that multiple people have conspired to file false police reports?" "I'm suggesting that one person has enough money and connections to make this look real." Marcus kept his voice steady, but inside he was screaming. "Karen Blackwood has been trying to destroy my business for months. She's filed complaints with the city, the Better Business Bureau, and now apparently the police. Mrs. Blackwood hasn't filed any complaints with our department." "No, but I'm betting if you dig into these people who have, you'll find they all have connections to her." Marcus pointed to the documents. "Check the law firm. Check the addresses. Check the references. I guarantee you'll find this all traces back to Karen Blackwood." Walsh made a note on her pad. "I'll look into it. But right now, I have to investigate the complaints that have been filed. Can you provide documentation for your whereabouts on the dates mentioned in these reports?" Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through his calendar. "I keep detailed records. On September 15th, when Patricia Vance claims I started her kitchen job, I was finishing the Peterson bathroom renovation. I have photos, receipts, and Mr. Peterson will vouch for me. And September 22nd, when Robert Chen claims his fence collapsed, I was working on the Miller deck extension. Again, I have documentation." Walsh took notes as Marcus went through each date, providing alibis and references. It was exhausting work, like trying to prove a negative, but Marcus had learned to be meticulous about record keeping after the first wave of Karen's attacks. "I'll need to verify all of this," Walsh said finally. "In the meantime, I have to advise you not to take on any new construction projects until this investigation is complete." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Detective, that's my livelihood. I have bills to pay, a daughter in college, I understand, but until we can sort this out, I can't have you potentially taking deposits from new clients." Walsh's tone was sympathetic but firm. "It's for everyone's protection." Marcus stood up, feeling suddenly old and tired. "How long will this take?" "That depends on how quickly I can verify your alibis and track down these complainants. Could be a few days, could be a few weeks." "A few weeks." Marcus did the math in his head: rent, truck payment, Sophia's textbooks, Mrs. Henderson's deck supplies. He'd be broke before Walsh finished her investigation. "One more thing," Walsh said as Marcus reached the door. "I'd advise you to avoid any contact with Mrs. Blackwood while this is ongoing. Any interaction could be seen as intimidation or harassment." Marcus nodded and left the station, stepping out into the steady rain that had begun to fall. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being investigated for crimes he hadn't committed while being warned away from the woman who was actually committing them. The drive back to Mrs. Henderson's house took him through the heart of Millbrook, past the courthouse where Karen had testified against his business license, past the bank where she'd poisoned his credit rating, past the country club where she held court with the other wives who controlled the town's social hierarchy. As he turned onto Maple Street, Marcus caught sight of a familiar white BMW parked outside the law offices of Brennan, Walsh and Associates. Even through the rain, he could see Karen's distinctive silhouette in the passenger seat, her phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly as she spoke. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Less than 2 hours after Detective Walsh had questioned him about fabricated complaints, here was Karen at the law firm that had generated those complaints. Marcus felt a surge of anger so intense it made his vision blur. He pulled over and watched as Karen ended her call and climbed out of the BMW. She was dressed for the weather in an expensive raincoat that probably cost more than most people's. Monthly salary, but she moved with the confidence of someone who knew the storms of life would never touch her. The rain drummed against his windshield as Marcus watched Karen disappear into the law office. Every instinct screamed at him to follow her, to confront her, to demand she stop her campaign of destruction. But Detective Walsh's warning echoed in his head. Any contact could be seen as intimidation or harassment. Marcus forced himself to drive away, but the image of Karen's satisfied smile burned in his memory. She was orchestrating his death. The eviction notice crumpled in Marcus's fist as he stood in his apartment doorway, rain dripping from his hair onto the threadbare carpet. The legal language was cold and efficient: 30 days to vacate, failure to pay rent, proceedings to commence immediately. But Marcus knew the real reason wasn't listed anywhere on the official document. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Sophia. "Dad, the bookstore says my financial aid was revoked. They won't release my textbooks. What's happening?" Marcus stared at the message, his hands trembling. Sophia was in her second year at State University, maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working part-time at the campus library. She'd earned an academic scholarship that covered most of her tuition, but the books, supplies, and living expenses still stretched Marcus's budget to its breaking point. If her financial aid had been revoked, he called the university's financial aid office, navigating through automated menus with growing dread. When he finally reached a human being, the news was worse than he'd feared. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rodriguez, but we received notification that your daughter's co-signer is under criminal investigation for fraud. University policy requires us to suspend aid until the matter is resolved." Criminal investigation? Marcus's voice cracked. "I haven't been charged with anything. I understand your frustration, sir, but the policy is clear. Once the investigation concludes, if no charges are filed, your daughter can reapply for aid." The line went dead. Marcus sank into his kitchen chair, surrounded by the modest apartment that had been his sanctuary for the past 3 years. The walls were covered with Sophia's artwork from high school, photos of construction projects he'd completed, and a framed certificate from the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce recognizing Rodriguez Construction as Small Business of the Year from 2 years ago. All of it meaningless now. His phone rang again. This time it was his ex-wife Maria. "Marcus, Sophia called me crying." "What the hell is going on?" Maria's voice carried the particular strain of a woman who'd been through too much already. Their divorce had been amicable, born more from the stress of Marcus's failing business than any fundamental incompatibility. But the worry in her voice now reminded him of the woman he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. "Karen Blackwood is trying to destroy me," Marcus said simply. "She's filed false police reports, gotten my business license suspended, and now they've revoked Sophia's financial aid." "Jesus, Marcus. What did you do to this woman?" "I existed." The bitterness in his voice surprised him. "I had the audacity to run a successful business in her neighborhood. I made the mistake of treating her like an equal instead of the royalty she thinks she is. Can you fight it?" Marcus looked around his apartment, calculating quickly. "With what? She's got lawyers and money and connections. I've got a truck and some tools. The truck that's falling apart. The truck that still runs." There was steel in his voice now, the sound of a man who'd been pushed too far. "Maria, I need you to help Sophia with her textbooks. Just this once. I'll pay you back as soon as I can." "Of course. But Marcus, maybe it's time to consider leaving Millbrook. Starting over somewhere else." The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. Leave Millbrook. This was his home, his community, the place where he'd built his reputation and raised his daughter. The mountains and valleys that surrounded the town were as much a part of him as his own bones. "I'm not running away. This isn't about running away. It's about survival." After Maria hung up, Marcus sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, listening to the rain against his windows. Thunder rolled across the valley, and in the distance, he could see lightning illuminating the storm clouds that clung to the mountain peaks. His phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. "Heard about the police investigation. This is bullshit. You need anything, you call me. Then another from Mrs. Henderson, "Dear, I don't believe a word of what they are saying about you. You're welcome to stay in my guest room until this blows over." And finally, from his old foreman Pete Gonzalez, "Boss, me and the guys are spreading the word. People remember good work. This won't last forever." The messages were lifelines thrown to a drowning man, reminders that Karen's poison hadn't reached everyone. But they also highlighted how far he'd fallen, how completely she'd isolated him from the community he'd served for 15 years. Marcus made himself a sandwich and ate it standing at his kitchen window, watching the storm intensify. Lightning strobed across the sky, and the wind howled through the valley like a living thing. Weather reports had been calling for severe thunderstorms all week, but this looked like something more serious. His phone rang again. This time it was Detective Walsh. "Mr. Rodriguez, I need to ask you some follow-up questions about the complaints against your business. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" More complaints. 3 more came in this afternoon. All with similar patterns of alleged fraud and abandonment. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of inevitability settling on his shoulders. "Detective. These people don't exist. Karen Blackwood is manufacturing evidence against me. That's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof? Work with me here. Check the addresses, the phone numbers, the references. I guarantee you'll find connections to Blackwood or her associates. I'm doing my job, Mr. Rodriguez. But right now, I have multiple complainants and you're the common denominator." After Walsh hung up, Marcus stood in his kitchen listening to the storm rage outside. The apartment felt like a cage, the walls closing in with each passing hour. He needed to move, to do something, to take action instead of just reacting to Karen's attacks. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. The rain hit him like a physical force as he stepped outside, soaking through his jacket in seconds. The parking lot was already flooding, and his truck sat like an island in the growing lake of water. Marcus climbed behind the wheel and started the engine, the familiar rumble a comfort in the chaos. He drove through the storm-lashed streets. Without conscious destination, his hands gripping the steering wheel as lightning illuminated the town in stark black and white. The roads were nearly empty, most sensible people having taken shelter from the worst storm to hit Millbrook in years. Marcus found himself driving past the construction sites where he'd worked, the houses where he'd installed kitchens and bathrooms. And decks. Each one was a reminder of what he'd built, what he'd lost, and what Karen was trying to take from him. The truck's headlights cut through the rain as he turned onto Hillcrest Drive, the exclusive neighborhood where Karen lived. He told himself he was just driving, just thinking, but his hands seemed to steer the truck toward her street of their own accord. The Blackwood house sat on 2 acres of perfectly manicured lawn, a sprawling colonial that spoke of old money and established power. Even in the storm, the landscape lighting illuminated the property like a stage set, all understated elegance and calculated grandeur. Marcus pulled over across the street, his truck's engine idling as he stared at the house where his enemy lived. Every window blazed with warm light, and he could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Karen was probably inside, safe and dry, planning her next move in the chess game that had consumed his life. Lightning split the sky, and in its brief illumination, Marcus saw movement in the driveway. A figure was running toward a white BMW, struggling with car keys in the rain. Even at this distance, he recognized Karen's distinctive silhouette. She was leaving. At nearly midnight, in the worst storm of the year, Karen Blackwood was going somewhere important enough to venture out into the tempest. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He put the truck in gear and began to follow. The BMW's taillights were barely visible through the rain as Karen navigated the winding roads that led out of Millbrook. She was driving fast, too fast for the conditions, her expensive SUV sliding slightly on the wet pavement as she took the curves. Marcus followed at a distance, his truck's superior weight and traction keeping him stable on the treacherous roads. He told himself he was just curious, that he wanted to see where she was going at this hour. But deep down, he knew he was looking for answers, for some weakness in her armor, for anything that might help him fight back. The road began to climb into the mountains, following the canyon where Miller Creek carved its way through the rock. It was a beautiful drive in good weather, popular with tourists and locals alike. But tonight, with the storm raging and the creek running high, it was dangerous territory. Karen's BMW fishtailed on a sharp curve, the vehicle sliding toward the guardrail before she corrected course. Marcus pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly worried that she might lose control completely. Whatever she'd done to him, he didn't want to watch her die. The road narrowed as it climbed higher, the guardrail the only thing separating them from a 60-foot drop into the canyon below. Marcus could hear the roar of the swollen creek even over the storm, and lightning revealed the churning water far below. Karen's brake lights flashed as she took another curve too fast. The BMW's rear end swung wide, and Marcus watched in horror as she overcorrected, the vehicle lurching back toward the center line. But the pavement was slick with rain and leaves, and physics was unforgiving. The BMW spun once, twice, then slammed into the guardrail with a screech of metal against. The rain hit Marcus like ice needles as he approached the BMW, each step deliberate and careful on the slick pavement. The vehicle groaned ominously, its front end suspended over the canyon while the rear wheels fought for purchase on the crumbling asphalt. Through the spider-webbed windshield, he could see Karen's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, her face a mask of terror in the strobing lightning. "Don't move!" Marcus shouted over the storm. "Any sudden motion could send you over." Karen's head turned toward him, her eyes wide with recognition and something that might have been relief. But when she tried to speak, her voice was lost in the howling wind. Marcus circled the BMW carefully, assessing the situation with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years solving structural problems. The guardrail had buckled but not broken completely, creating a precarious fulcrum that balanced the vehicle between safety and catastrophe. The rear tires were barely touching solid ground, and he could see loose gravel sliding into the abyss with each gust of wind. "Karen, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Marcus called out, moving closer to the driver's side window. "I'm going to get you out of there, but you have to do exactly what I say." Through the glass, he saw her nod frantically. The composed, imperious woman who had destroyed his life was gone, replaced by someone raw and desperate and utterly human. Marcus ran back to his truck, his mind already working through the physics of the rescue. The BMW probably weighed close to 6,000 pounds, and most of that weight was now cantilevered over the canyon. He'd need leverage, stability, and a way to counterbalance the vehicle's momentum. In the truck bed, secured under a heavy tarp, were the tools of his trade. A come-along winch, heavy-duty chains, construction rope, and a portable hydraulic jack. Equipment he'd accumulated over 15 years of solving impossible problems and building things that lasted. The wind nearly knocked him over as he dragged the equipment to the BMW. Rain stung his eyes and made everything slippery, but Marcus had worked in worse conditions. He'd poured concrete in snowstorms and hung drywall during heat waves. This was just another job site, just another problem to solve. "I'm going to attach a cable to your car," he shouted to Karen. "When I do, you might feel some movement. Don't panic." The BMW's rear bumper was a testament to German engineering, solid and substantial. Marcus wrapped the heavy chain around it twice, securing it with a come-along hook that was rated for 10,000 pounds. The other end of the chain went to the frame of his truck, creating a lifeline between the two vehicles. As he tightened the chain, the BMW shifted slightly, metal groaning against metal. Karen's scream was audible even over the storm, a sound of pure terror that cut through Marcus like a blade. "It's okay," he called out. "That's supposed to happen. The chain is taking some of the weight." But Marcus could see the problem even as he said it. The chain would prevent the BMW from plunging into the canyon, but it wouldn't pull the vehicle back to safety. For that, he needed to change the physics of the situation. Working by lightning flash and the truck's headlights, Marcus positioned the hydraulic jack against the BMW's rear axle. It was a risky maneuver. If the jack slipped or the vehicle shifted wrong, the sudden movement could snap the chain and send both Karen and the BMW tumbling into the darkness. "Karen, I need you to very slowly release your brake pedal," Marcus shouted. "Let the chain take the weight." He saw her shake her head violently, her hands still frozen on the steering wheel. "Trust me," Marcus said, his voice somehow carrying over the storm. "I know what I'm doing." Through the rain-streaked glass, their eyes met. For a moment, the animosity between them evaporated, replaced by the primal connection between someone In mortal danger and the person trying to save them. Karen nodded once and slowly lifted her foot from the brake. The BMW settled back against the chain with a metallic groan. The truck's frame creaked under the sudden load, but it held. Marcus had built that vehicle for work, not show, and 15 years of hauling construction materials had made it stronger than anything that rolled off a factory floor. Now came the dangerous part. Marcus activated the hydraulic jack, slowly, lifting the BMW's rear end while the chain prevented it from sliding backward. Inch by inch, the vehicle's weight shifted from the canyon side to the road side of the fulcrum. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark detail, the BMW suspended between earth and sky, the chain stretched taut between the vehicles and Marcus Rodriguez working with methodical precision to save the life of the woman who had tried to destroy him. As the jack reached its full extension, Marcus could see that it wouldn't be enough. The BMW was more stable now, but still precariously balanced on the edge of disaster. He needed more leverage, more lift, more of everything. That's when he remembered the construction rope in his truck bed. High tensile strength, designed for securing loads that could kill if they shifted wrong. Marcus tied one end to the BMW's rear axle and threaded the other end through a pulley that he anchored to his truck's trailer hitch. "Karen, I'm going to try something," he called out. "When I count to 3, I need you to very slowly crawl toward the back seat. The extra weight in the rear might be enough to tip the balance." He could see her shaking her head again, paralyzed by fear. "Look at me," Marcus commanded, his voice cutting through the storm with surprising authority. "I've been building things for 20 years. I understand weight and balance and leverage. I know how to solve problems that seem impossible. But I need you to trust me." Karen stared at him through the rain-streaked glass, this man who had every reason to let her die, who had every justification for walking away and leaving her to the consequences of her own recklessness. But instead of abandonment, she saw determination. Instead of revenge, she saw the focused competence of someone who had spent his life fixing things that were broken. "Okay," she mouthed, the word lost in the wind but clear in her expression. Marcus positioned himself at the rope and began to pull, using his entire body weight to create mechanical advantage. The BMW shifted slightly, its rear end rising another precious inch. Gravel cascaded into the canyon as the vehicle's weight redistributed. "Now," Marcus shouted. "Move to the back seat." Through the BMW's rear window, he watched Karen unbuckle her seatbelt and begin the terrifying crawl toward the back of the vehicle. Every movement caused the car to shift slightly, but the combination of chain, jack, and rope held firm. As Karen's weight moved rearward, Marcus felt the tension in the rope decrease. The BMW was finally stable, its center of gravity shifted away from the precipice. But they weren't safe yet. "I'm going to pull you back onto the road," Marcus called out. "Hold on tight." He wrapped the rope around his waist and began to walk backward, using his legs and back to slowly drag the BMW away from the edge. His boots slipped on the wet pavement, and his muscles screamed in protest, but inch by inch, the vehicle moved toward safety. The process took 20 minutes that felt like hours. When the BMW's front wheels finally touched solid ground, Marcus collapsed against his truck, exhausted and soaked to the bone. Through the rain, he could see Karen sitting in her back seat, crying with relief. Marcus walked to the BMW's rear door and opened it, rain immediately soaking the leather interior. Karen looked up at him, her perfect makeup streaked with tears, her expensive clothes rumpled and stained. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything I've done to you, why did you save me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that had been echoing in his own mind. "Because that's who I am," he said finally. "I build things. I fix things. I help people. That doesn't change because you tried to destroy me." Karen stared at him, seeing perhaps for the first time the man she had been trying to crush. Not a threat to be eliminated or a competitor to be defeated, but a human being with depth and character and an unshakable moral compass. "I'm sorry," she said, the words barely audible over the storm. "I'm so sorry for what I've done." Marcus nodded once, then began gathering his equipment. The rescue was complete, but the reckoning was just beginning. As he loaded the jack and chains back into his truck, Karen climbed out of the BMW and stood in the rain, watching him work. "Marcus," she called out as he prepared to leave. "What happens now?" He paused, his hand on the truck's door handle. "Now you go home to your family. And tomorrow you figure out how to undo the damage you've caused. And if I don't?" Marcus turned to face her, rain streaming down his face. "Then you'll have to live with knowing that the man whose life you tried to destroy saved yours when you needed it most. And you'll have to explain to yourself why that wasn't enough to make you a better person." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Karen stood alone on the mountain road, watching the taillights of the rusty truck that had saved her life disappear into the storm. In the distance, thunder rolled across the valley, but the worst of the tempest was passing. By morning, the sun would shine again on Millbrook, and Karen Blackwood would have to decide what kind of person she wanted to be in the light of a new day. Marcus arrived home at 3:17 a.m., his clothes still damp from the storm, his body aching from the rescue. He sat in his truck for several minutes, engine off, listening to the gentle patter of rain that was all that remained of the tempest. The eviction notice still waited on his kitchen table, Sophia's financial aid was still suspended, and Detective Walsh would still want answers in the morning. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. He showered and tried to sleep. But his mind kept replaying the moment when Karen had asked him why he'd saved her. The question had an answer that went deeper than words, rooted in the values his grandfather had taught him when he'd first put tools in a 12-year-old boy's hands. "Mijo," the old man had said, "a man's worth isn't measured by what he builds for himself, but by what he builds for others. And sometimes, the most important thing you can build is a bridge over someone else's darkest moment." At 6:30 a.m., Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer. "Mr. Rodriguez. This is Patricia Vance." "Oh. I need to speak with you." Marcus sat up straighter. Patricia Vance was one of the names on the false police complaints against him. "I'm listening. I'm calling to confess. I never hired your company. I never had any work done by you. Mrs. Blackwood paid me to file a false complaint." The woman's voice was shaking. She said, "It would just be paperwork, that nothing serious would happen. But then I heard about your daughter's financial aid being revoked, and I can't live with myself." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of vindication and exhaustion. "Mrs. Vance, are you willing to tell this to the police?" "Yes. I'm calling Detective Walsh next. And Mr. Rodriguez. I'm truly sorry. I needed the money, but that's no excuse for what I've done." The call ended, but Marcus's phone immediately rang again. This time it was Robert Chen, David's nephew, with a similar confession. Then came the third caller, and the fourth. By 8 a.m., Marcus had received calls from 6 different people, all admitting to filing false complaints at Karen's behest. The last call came from Detective Walsh herself. "Mr. Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. We've had multiple people come forward this morning confessing to filing fraudulent complaints. The investigation into your business is officially closed." "What? About charges against the people who filed false reports?" "That's complicated. Most of them were paid relatively small amounts and seemed to be genuinely remorseful. We'll have to see how the DA wants to proceed." "And Karen Blackwood?" There was a pause. "Mrs. Blackwood hasn't responded to our requests for an interview yet. But conspiracy to file false police reports is a serious charge. We'll be pursuing it fully." Marcus hung up and made coffee, trying to process the morning's revelations. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Dad, the financial aid office called. They are reinstating my scholarship immediately and expediting my book allowance." "What happened?" Before he could respond, there was a knock at his door. Marcus opened it to find David Chen standing in the hallway, his face creased with concern and determination. "Marcus, I just heard what my nephew did. I'm mortified. He's been struggling financially since his divorce, but that's no excuse." David stepped inside, his small frame somehow filling the space with authority. "I want to make this right. David, you don't need to. Yes, I do. You've been a good customer and a good man, and you got caught up in something that should never have happened. David pulled out an envelope. I've talked to 12 business owners in town. We are pooling our resources to help you restart Rodriguez Construction. Consider it a loan at 0% interest, payable when you're back on your feet. Marcus opened the envelope and stared at the check inside. $50,000. Enough to cover his debts, rent a proper workshop, and begin rebuilding everything Karen had destroyed. I can't accept this. You can and you will. And Marcus, we want to offer you an exclusive contract to handle all maintenance and renovation work for the downtown business district. Mrs. Blackwood's reach doesn't extend to people who care more about character than connections. After David left, Marcus sat in his kitchen holding the check, overwhelmed by the rapid reversal of his fortunes. But the morning's biggest surprise was yet to come. At 10:30 a.m., a white BMW X7 pulled into his apartment complex's parking lot. Karen Blackwood climbed out of the vehicle, moving stiffly, her usually perfect appearance replaced by something more human. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face free of makeup. She looked like she hadn't slept. Marcus met her at his door, unsure of what to expect. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. Marcus stepped aside and Karen entered his modest apartment. She looked around at the photographs of Sophia, the certificates on the walls. The evidence of a life built through honest work and genuine relationships. "I spent the night thinking about what you said," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About having to live with myself. About explaining why your saving my life wasn't enough to make me a better person." She sat down uninvited at his kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I called Detective Walsh this morning. I confessed to everything. The false complaints, the payments to witnesses, the campaign to destroy your business." Karen looked up at Marcus, her eyes red with tears. "I also called the university and had your daughter's financial aid fully reinstated with additional scholarship money from my personal foundation." Marcus remained standing, studying this woman who had upended his life. "Why now?" "Because you saved me. Not just from the canyon, but from myself." Karen's voice broke slightly. "I was driving to meet with a private investigator last night. I'd hired him to dig up dirt on your ex-wife and daughter. I was going to destroy them too, just to hurt you more completely." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. The depth of Karen's malice was staggering, but so was her apparent transformation. "When I was hanging over that canyon, I realized something," Karen continued. "I've spent so much energy tearing people down that I've forgotten what it feels like to build anything up. And you risked your life to save someone who tried to destroy everything you loved." Karen reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila folder. "These are all the documents related to my campaign against you. Bank records showing the payments, correspondence with lawyers, everything. I'm turning it all over to the authorities." She placed the folder on the table between them. "I'm also liquidating some investments to create a fund for small business owners who've been unfairly targeted by frivolous lawsuits. I can't undo what I've done, but maybe I can prevent it from happening to others." Marcus picked up the folder, feeling its weight. "What do you want from me, Karen?" "Nothing," she said simply. "I don't deserve your forgiveness and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that the person who tried to destroy you is gone. What's left is someone who's going to spend the rest of her life trying to build something worthwhile." Karen stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Your truck saved my life. But more than that, your character saved my soul. I'll never forget that." After she left, Marcus sat alone with the folder, processing everything that had happened in the past 18 hours. His phone rang constantly, Detective Walsh with updates, business owners offering contracts, Sophia calling to thank him for somehow fixing her financial aid. But the call that mattered most came at sunset. It was Mrs. Henderson. "Marcus, dear. I've been hearing the most wonderful news all day. Something about the truth finally coming to light." "Yes, It seems like justice found its way after all." Justice has a way of doing that, doesn't it? Especially when good people refuse to compromise their principles. There was warmth in the old woman's voice. Now, I have a project for you. My neighbor wants to know if Rodriguez Construction might be available to build her a new deck. Marcus looked out his window at his rust-stained truck sitting in the parking lot. The same vehicle Karen had mocked just yesterday was now a symbol of something larger, the power of fundamental decency to overcome calculated cruelty, the strength found in helping others even when you've been hurt, and the truth that what you build with your hands and heart will always matter more than what others try to tear down with lies. Tell her I'll be there tomorrow to give her an estimate, Marcus said. Rodriguez Construction is back in business. As the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Millbrook, Marcus Rodriguez began planning his future. There would be decks to build, kitchens to renovate, and problems to solve. There would be people who needed help, and he would be there to provide it. And somewhere across town, Karen Blackwood was learning what it meant to build something instead of tearing it down, one small act of redemption at a time. The storm had passed, the truth had emerged, and life in Millbrook would never be quite the same. But sometimes, the most powerful changes come not from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but from the simple choice to do what's right, even when, especially when, no one is watching. Marcus smiled as he started making dinner, the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing from a voicemail she'd left earlier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, for the first time in months, Marcus Rodriguez slept the sleep of a man whose conscience was clear and